The Ottoman Empire did not fear its enemies as much as it feared instability. And few things threatened stability more than royal blood placed in the wrong hands. Inside the walls of the Imperial palace, Ottoman princesses were born into a life that appeared flawless. Gold-lined corridors, silken garments, servants trained to obey without question. From the outside it looked like privilege perfected. But privilege was never the purpose. Control was. From the moment a princess was born, her life was no longer her own. She was not raised to rule, nor was she meant to disappear. She existed in a narrow space between visibility and confinement. Alive, honored, and carefully neutralized. Because in dynastic systems, daughters are dangerous. A princess carried legitimacy. Through marriage she could redirect loyalty. Through childbirth she could create alternative claims. Through influence she could destabilize succession. The Ottoman solution was not execution. That was too crude. Too final. Instead, they engineered a system where power was removed without bloodshed. The palace was that system. Before we continue, if you want history explored without comfort or illusion, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to the History Veil, like the video, and share it with those who believe the past should be examined honestly. Now let's continue. Ottoman princesses were educated extensively. They learned languages, theology, poetry, and court etiquette. They understood politics not through participation but observation. They watched decisions unfold without ever being allowed to shape them. This was intentional. Knowledge without agency is safe. Authority without action cannot threaten. Movement was restricted early. Princesses could walk freely only within designated palace spaces. Gardens had no exits. Corridors looped inward. Windows faced courtyards rather than streets. The palace created the illusion of vastness while eliminating escape. Privacy did not exist. Servants were assigned not just to serve but to observe. Every interaction was monitored. Every visitor recorded. Correspondence filtered. A princess learned quickly that silence was protection. Speech carried risk. Trust was uncertain. This produced self-control more effective than force. Marriage, when permitted, was political theater. Princesses were not wed to powerful princes or rival kings. They were married to officials whose power depended entirely on the sultan. Men without independent armies. Men without popular support. Men who could be removed without consequence. And even then, conditions applied. A princess did not disappear into her husband's world. Her household remained under palace oversight. Her finances were managed. Her children, if any, were watched. If her husband fell from favor, she did not follow him. She remained loyal to the state that confined her. Many princesses never married at all. Unmarried daughters lived long lives inside palace walls, surrounded by luxury and denied authorship. They could sponsor buildings, endow charities, patronize art. These actions were permitted because they posed no threat. Benevolence was acceptable. Power was not. This was not cruelty born of neglect. It was discipline born of fear. The Ottomans understood that killing rivals created instability. Martyrs inspire resistance. Public violence invites challenge. Quiet containment, on the other hand, dissolves threats before they form. Princesses were removed from politics not by punishment, but by design. Their fertility was treated as a liability. Unlike concubines whose children sustained the dynasty, princesses could produce alternative lines of legitimacy. So marriages were delayed. Opportunities limited. In some periods they were married past childbearing age. In others, intimacy was discouraged altogether. Motherhood did not restore freedom. It extended surveillance. Children born to princesses were managed carefully. Sons were absorbed into bureaucratic systems that diluted claim. Daughters inherited the same controlled existence. Bloodline was preserved. Autonomy was not. This system endured for centuries. An Ottoman princess could live 60 or 70 years without ever exercising meaningful choice. No rebellion. No courtroom. No execution. Just decades of waiting inside carefully maintained walls. Her life intact in body, absent in consequence. European monarchies executed threats. The Ottomans archived them. This approach shaped palace culture deeply. Silence became virtue. Obedience became honor. Withdrawal became safety. Girls learned early what was expected. Aspiration was reframed as danger. Curiosity softened into compliance. Resistance became unthinkable not because it was punished, but because it was never allowed to form. This is why history records so few rebellions. Not because oppression was mild, but because it was complete. Some princesses adapted creatively. They influenced architecture, funded education, supported religious institutions. These contributions were tolerated because they enhanced imperial image without challenging authority. Influence was allowed as long as it remained indirect. Direct power remained forbidden. The palace thus produced generations of women who understood governance intimately while being excluded from it entirely. They heard decisions that reshaped borders. They witnessed wars declared. They saw rulers rise and fall. And they remained spectators. To be surrounded by power and denied participation is a specific form of erasure. A princess could see the empire move and remain motionless within it. She could carry the highest bloodline and never belong to herself. Her life was preserved not for who she was, but for what she prevented. This was the empire's most refined cruelty. Not pain inflicted in moments, but futures removed quietly across lifetimes. And because it was elegant, it survived. In the next part, we will go deeper into how this system functioned daily. The rules that governed isolation. The mechanisms that enforced obedience without chains. And how containment was disguised so effectively that it passed for privilege. Because what the Ottomans did to their princesses was not dramatic. It was permanent. The isolation of Ottoman princesses was not chaos. It was administration. Every aspect of their lives followed a structure designed to prevent one outcome above all others: independent power. The palace did not rely on fear alone. It relied on predictability. When a life is mapped before it begins, rebellion rarely finds space to grow. Daily routines were fixed early. Prayer, study, supervised leisure, controlled social interaction. Nothing was spontaneous. Even moments of rest occurred within expectation. This repetition was not accidental. Routine dulls ambition. When days resemble one another, imagination weakens. Surveillance did not feel like punishment. It felt like normality. Princesses were surrounded by attendants who appeared devoted, even affectionate. But affection was conditional. Loyalty flowed upward, not inward. A princess never knew which words would be repeated, which silences would be noted. Over time, this uncertainty trained restraint. Thought remained internal. Speech became cautious. The palace did not need to threaten. It only needed to listen. Education reinforced this balance. Princesses were taught to read political reality without participating in it. They learned court history, diplomacy, and law as spectators. Knowledge sharpened awareness of limitation rather than expanding possibility. They understood exactly what they could never become. This awareness was the boundary. Marriage policies made this clearer. When a princess married, the ceremony appeared grand, but the terms were restrictive. Husbands were chosen for obedience, not brilliance. Their fortunes depended entirely on imperial favor. Their movements were monitored. Their household staffed with palace-approved servants. A princess did not gain a new domain. She extended the palace's reach. If a husband displayed ambition, consequences followed quickly. Dismissal, exile, sometimes execution. The princess was expected to accept this without protest. Emotional attachment was treated as immaturity. Loyalty belonged to the state alone. Widowhood brought no liberation. Widowed princesses often returned fully to palace life. Their rank increased symbolically, but autonomy did not. They became custodians of tradition, advisors on etiquette, living reminders of continuity. Respected, consulted, and still confined. The most sensitive issue remained fertility. Unlike the sultan's concubines, whose children reinforced the dynasty, princesses represented a different risk. Sons born to royal women could claim legitimacy beyond control. Even weak claims threatened order. The empire responded not with bans but with delay. Marriages occurred late. Opportunities narrowed. Intimacy discouraged. In some eras, princesses married after their childbearing years. In others, they remained unmarried entirely. Fertility was managed not through force but through timing. When children were born, surveillance intensified. Sons were absorbed into administrative or military systems designed to dilute claim. Daughters inherited the same constrained future. Bloodline continued. Autonomy did not. This produced a peculiar outcome. Ottoman princesses lived lives that appeared stable, dignified, and safe. They were not publicly humiliated. They were not exiled en masse. They were not executed. Compared to the violence faced by others, their existence seemed gentle. But gentleness can still erase. A life preserved without authorship becomes symbolic rather than real. Princesses were valued for what they prevented, not for what they achieved. Their success was measured in silence. Over generations, this silence became tradition. Girls learned early that curiosity invited correction, that ambition was unbecoming, that obedience was strength. Resistance did not need to be crushed. It was never allowed to form. This is why historical records show few acts of defiance. Not because the system was kind, but because it was complete. Some princesses sought meaning through permitted channels. Patronage of architecture, religious endowments, support for education. These acts were encouraged because they enhanced imperial prestige without threatening authority. Influence was tolerated as long as it remained indirect. Direct power remained forbidden. The palace thus created women who understood statecraft deeply yet were barred from shaping it. They heard decisions that moved armies. They watched borders shift. They saw rulers rise and fall. And they remained spectators. Spectatorship is rarely recognized as suffering. But witnessing power without agency creates internal conflict. Over time, identity contracts to fit available space. Desire is reshaped into acceptance. Acceptance is mistaken for peace. This was the system's quiet efficiency. No chains. No prisons. No executions. Just lives redirected inward until outward impact disappeared. In the next part, we will confront how this system ended and how history chose to remember these women. How confinement was reframed as privilege. How silence became evidence of consent. And how the absence of revolt was used to justify the design. Because the final cruelty was not isolation itself. It was how isolation was explained away. The system that confined Ottoman princesses did not end with a single decree. It faded slowly, leaving its deepest damage intact. As the empire entered its final centuries, reforms arrived under pressure from within and without. Western observers criticized palace customs. Administrators spoke of modernization. Restrictions loosened in appearance. Princesses gained limited mobility. Some traveled. Some interacted cautiously with public institutions. From the outside it looked like progress. But lives shaped by decades of control do not reset overnight. Most princesses who reached this era had already spent their formative years within confinement. Silence had become instinct. Obedience had become identity. Opportunity arrived late, after imagination had been trained away. Freedom delayed does not restore what was denied. It only reveals how much was lost. This is the part history struggles to name. Ottoman princesses were never publicly brutalized. They were never paraded in chains. They were never executed. Their suffering did not fit familiar categories. It unfolded without spectacle, which made it easy to misinterpret. Comfort was mistaken for choice. Silence for consent. Longevity for fulfillment. As the empire dissolved, narratives softened. Princesses were remembered as elegant figures, symbols of refinement and grace. Their isolation was reframed as protection. Their restriction as honor. The absence of rebellion became evidence that the system had been benign. This reinterpretation served memory more than truth. It allowed the empire's legacy to appear orderly rather than restrictive. It transformed policy into tradition. It replaced coercion with culture. And because princesses left few personal records, there was little to challenge this version. Silence became proof. Yet fragments tell another story. Private letters surfaced late. Diaries appeared in pieces. Accounts spoke of boredom that felt endless. Of frustration without outlet. Of lives observed rather than lived. These were often dismissed as individual complaints, not systemic design. But patterns do not repeat by accident. Across generations the same structure appears. Education without agency. Marriage without partnership. Motherhood without authority. Lives preserved in form and erased in consequence. This was not a failure of compassion. It was a success of strategy. The Ottoman state prioritized continuity over individual fulfillment. Princesses were neutralized not because they were weak, but because they were powerful in ways the system could not safely allow. Their bloodline was too valuable to kill and too dangerous to free. So the empire chose a third path. Preservation without autonomy. This approach worked politically. Succession crises fueled by royal women were minimized. Rival power centers were avoided. Stability endured longer than it otherwise might have. From the perspective of governance, the system succeeded. From the perspective of human life, it extracted a quiet cost. To exist beside power without the ability to shape it creates a specific erosion. Identity narrows. Desire contracts. Ambition becomes liability. Over time, the self adapts to confinement so thoroughly that the boundaries feel natural. This is why resistance rarely appears in the record. Not because injustice was mild, but because it was normalized. The most effective control is the kind that no longer needs to announce itself. Ottoman princesses were trained to internalize limits, to view restriction as duty, to interpret absence of choice as safety. When systems teach people to guard their own confinement, force becomes unnecessary. This lesson extends beyond one empire. History often focuses on visible cruelty because it is easier to condemn. Quiet deprivation resists outrage. It wears the mask of order. It hides behind ceremony. It survives by appearing reasonable. The palace system demonstrates how domination can operate without violence, how lives can be redirected without scars, and how futures can be removed without bloodshed. This is why the phrase "worse than death" matters. Death ends possibility. This system prolonged impossibility. An Ottoman princess could live a full lifespan without ever belonging fully to herself. She could witness history unfold while remaining excluded from it. She could carry the highest lineage and never exercise consequence. Existence without authorship is its own form of loss. Remembering these women does not require condemnation alone. It requires precision. Precision in recognizing how power disguises itself. Precision in separating comfort from freedom. Precision in acknowledging that absence of pain does not equal presence of justice. The Ottomans did not execute their princesses. They removed their futures. And then they taught history to call it protection.